what can really limit you from achieving what might feel like an impossible goal, both within your own life or your own organization? It turns out it's only two things. In this video, I'm going to be sharing with you what those two things are, how they are related, and how theory of constraints provides us with a very simple process to identify and overcome each of these two elements. Hi, my name is Dr. Alan Barnard. I'm CEO of Goldratt Research Labs. We are passionate about helping individuals and organizations achieve what might feel like impossible goals and help them make impossible decisions. This video is part of a video series I'm recording on what is theory of constraints. If you haven't watched the first video where I explain why theory of constraints is a theory and how it can help us make some really tough decisions within our own life or our own organization, I would highly recommend that you watch that. I will provide the link below. So let's get to the question. What can really limit us from achieving a goal that might feel like it's an impossible goal within our life or our organization? There are only two things: constraints and unresolved conflicts. Both start with a C, so easy to remember. Constraints and conflicts. When Dr. Ellie Goldratt created the theory of constraints, he created the 5 focusing steps as the main process to achieve ongoing improvement. So what are the 5 focusing steps? Well, it starts off with kind of an implicit step. I call it step 0, which is to define the goal as clearly as possible and how you're going to measure it. The more clearly you can define it, the easier the next steps will be. What do you want to achieve? By when? For who? And how much? That is a clear definition of a goal, and not just one number, but a series of numbers, a series of milestones to say where you want to take your personal performance or the performance of your organization to over the next few months and years, etc. So imagine you have a clear goal now. Now comes the next step. Step number 1, identify the system constraints. Take note that Goldratt used plural, not singular, even though it's so simple to think about. There's one weakest link, one system constraint. There can be cases, and often are cases, where there's more than one constraint. So what is a constraint? A constraint is simply a resource that I need to achieve the goal, but I don't have enough of. What are the type of constraints? Any organization, there's only 4 types of constraint. I don't have enough demand for the products or services that I need to produce to achieve the goal, or I don't have enough capacity to deliver enough of that product or service to achieve the goal, or I don't have enough supply, some external resource that I need, raw materials, components, skills, even information or knowledge, or 4th, I don't have enough cash to be able to buy the supplies and pay for all the other costs. Those 4 and only those 4 can become the constraint of an organization. Now, there's, of course, at a deeper level, you can argue that the real constraint in all organizations is the limited management attention. There will always be more things that demand our attention than what we have available attention, but it's essentially that scarce resource that limits or blocks us from addressing these 4 types of constraint. So that's the constraint of the system. Step 2 says, decide how to better exploit and not waste the scarce resource. What does that mean? So let's imagine you have a market constraint. The first thing you want to do is to see how big is the gap between what's available and how much of that you currently are using. So what's available? What is the market size for the products and services that you currently provide through the channels that you provide? So in the areas that you're already selling, or through the channels that you're already selling. And in most cases, what you'll find out that there's a huge gap. You might have only 1% or 2% or 5% of the market share. So the rest is all available for exploitation. So decide how to better exploit and not waste the system constraint means identifying those conditions that if you could satisfy them, you could get more demand. You could get customers to be willing to pay more, buy more frequently. What if the constraint was capacity? Then deciding how to better exploit it means identifying where the internal bottleneck is, and secondly, where is it losing time and capacity because of starvation or blockage or planned or unplanned maintenance or working on bad quality product, or most of the time losing a lot of capacity and time producing stuff that's not needed or not needed now. Often you don't have a real constraint, you're just wasting what you've got. Well, what if the constraint was in supply? Same thing. How much is available? How much are you getting? What are the conditions that if you could satisfy them would get your suppliers to willingly sell more to you, or you can get your hands on more of whatever it is that you need. And the same with cash is how much is available from your current investors or bank versus how much are you getting? What are the conditions to satisfy? Those two steps are pretty easy conceptually. The only complication could be that I have multiple constraints, and not just multiple constraints. So there's more than one of those four that I don't have enough of to achieve the goal, but they are interacting, causing absolute chaos. So I don't have enough demand, but I also don't have enough cash. And I don't have enough cash, I can't buy enough supplies, so I can't produce enough of the product or services or in the time frame that the customers want. So I don't get enough sales, which means I don't get enough cash, and then it's just a vicious cycle. In those cases where you have multiple constraints that interact, best is to take your goal, lower the goal until one becomes a constraint where you have enough of the others, focus on just better exploiting that one, go through the process, and then systematically increase your goal as you get more and more output from the system. But let's go on to step 3 of the 5 focusing steps. Subordinate everything to the above decision, the decision about how to better exploit. So you have a condition now that says by satisfying this condition means we will be able to better exploit what we've got and not waste it. That is where the whole idea of identifying and resolving conflicts come in. So whatever condition you've identified that's required to better utilize the scarce resource, that will trigger a change in one of the rules that you're currently using as a strategy or tactic, as a policy, a process, a measurement. It will trigger you to change that. That might be in direct conflict with an existing rule that you are using. Unless you can resolve those conflicts, you'll get stuck. So you need the ability to identify and resolve conflicts between what's the best rule to use. Now, Dr. Gold had created a methodology called the evaporating cloud technique to help us do that, to verbalize clearly what these conflicts are between what rule to use. Maybe use a rule that's good for one part versus use a rule that's good for the system, considering where the constraint is now, or use a rule that's better for the short term versus the long term. Well, that technique, the evaporating cloud, had some benefits, but it also had some major limits. The limitation of the evaporating cloud was it looked at these two tactics, these two options that you have for what rules to use, but it only looked at their unique positives for each, the unique needs that each are satisfying. So let's assume you have a market constraint. You've identified one of the conditions to better exploit your current market is to price based on perception of value. But now it puts you in a conflict because your current pricing mechanism prices not based on perception of value, but based on cost plus. Which one should I use? If I can't resolve that conflict, I'll get stuck with the status quo, with inertia, and I won't be able to improve my performance. Now, if you did an evaporating cloud for these two options, price based on perception of value, that's the change. The status quo is price based on cost plus. What's the needs that each are satisfying? Pricing based on perception of value satisfy the need, which is a hypothesis that customers might be willing to buy more or pay more if I do price based on their perception of value. What's the need satisfied by cost plus based pricing is that we have predictable margins. Both of those needs or both of those pros are required to achieve our goal, which is profitable and sustainable growth, not just in sales, but also in profitability. So what's the issue? Well, each of these rules also have a unique negative. And if we don't consider the unique negative of each of these rules, we might come up with a suboptimum decision. And as a result, what I did was I took the evaporating cloud method, I combined it with Benjamin Franklin's pro-con list to create a pro-con cloud methodology. And that also looks at the unique cons of each of these. So the unique cons of pricing based on perception of value, there's always two cons. There's the effort, potential effort of climbing up that mountain, making this new change, and what if it's not worth it? And there's also the potential risks of falling down. So what's the potential effort? Well, we don't know what the perception of value might be for our current products or services. That might require a lot of effort to determine what it is. And secondly, there's always the risk that I start pricing based on perception of value, but it triggers a price that's either too high, so I got it wrong and nobody buys, or it's too low and I don't make enough margin. So I have to consider both of those elements when I'm trying to come up with a new win-win solution. The unique con of the cost plus based pricing is that it can result in a price that's also too high or too low. And as a result, I either miss out on a specific market, or I refuse orders that are coming in because the orders are below the pricing that I've used based on standard costing. The pro-con cloud method helps me to identify what these conflicts are, look at the unique pros and cons of each of these options, and then help us to develop new options, better options that has most of the pros with as few as possible of the cons. So big upside if it works, small downside if it doesn't. I need the ability to identify and resolve these conflicts for me to take that next step. Well, what if the constraint was in operations? What could be a conflict there? Well, imagine I have a constraint that's now in operations. And I've decided that in order to get more out of my existing resources, I should run overtime on one of the areas. But I have a rule currently that says no overtime because our margins are too low. Now what do? If I don't resolve that conflict, I'll get stuck, or it will cause a lot of disharmony in the company. So again, I can use the pro-con cloud method as a way of clearly verbalizing the conflict that we now face, which is, on the one side, the change I want to make is to be able to authorize overtime or maybe an additional shift for the bottleneck area, versus don't allow any overtime, regardless of which area it is. And I need to find the unique pros and cons of each of those and come up with a better solution that has all the pros without any of the cons. But it could also be a very practical issue about how best to allocate my capacity if I have an internal constraint. So imagine you're a project environment and you have 5 projects at any point in time and you have 5 teams. How should you allocate your capacity? Your current rule is that you allocate 1 team per project. And maybe over time, what might have happened is that from time to time a project is delayed, so you might have said we allocate 2 projects per team. So now I have 10 projects in the pipeline with 5 teams. That's the current way that we manage. Well, to get more out of these 5 teams, there could be a different one, which is very counterintuitive, that says, what if I don't allocate 2 projects per team, or even just 1 project per team, but I allocate all 5 teams on the first project? Or I allocate 2 teams on the first project, 2 teams on the second project, and the other team I keep as a buffer so I can quickly move to whichever project is most delayed. Could that be the best way of doing much more with the same resources? Well, for those type of environments, you can't answer that question in a logical way, because our intuition is just not good when it comes to these very complex scheduling. There are so many possible permutations of how to allocate scarce resources, whether you're in a project environment or manufacturing or distribution or retail environment, where the scarce resources, the shelf space that you have, the amount of inventory that you carry, it's just too overwhelming we just don't have the intuition to decide which of these rules are best for the system, not just for operational performance, but also financial performance. The only way to resolve those type of conflicts is you can, of course, do a pilot, have a test case where you are implementing the new rule, the control group that are keep on using the old rule, and you see which performs the best. But these pilots can take a long time. They can be very costly and very risky, and on top of that, very hard to control that you really have matching conditions and that only changes the rule. A much faster, better, lower cost, lower risk way of doing that is by doing these type of simulation model, doing these type of pilots within a simulation model. We've developed a whole range of simulation models for supply chains, for factories, for distribution centers, for retailers, for mines, for project environments where you can run scenario comparisons between these various rules. And we have a whole library of best practices that includes theory of constraints, lean, agile, DDMRP, etc. And you can directly compare not which conceptually is better, but which ones are better for your environment, for the constraints that you're facing, for the market conditions that you are facing. So that's what step 3 is all about. Subordinate everything to the above decision means identifying any existing rule, any policy, process, measurement that is in direct conflict with a new decision about what the new rules are we need to better exploit and not waste it. When we then get to step 4, which is elevate the system constraint, it says our goal is here, our performance was here, we're now better exploiting by subordinating, we've gotten up to there. There's still a gap. Now is the time to go and elevate the constraint, go in to get more of it. So if it's in the market, if the constraint is in the market, now is the time to think about adding additional products or services, or going to sell your existing products or services into new markets, new channels, whichever is the lowest cost, the lowest risk way of elevating, by adding products or services or by going into new markets with the existing one. That's the best option. If it's a capacity constraint, then either work additional shifts or go and buy more. If it's supply, go and find another supplier or maybe redesign the product so it doesn't require so much or that component at all. If it's cash, go out and get another investor. So that's elevating the system constraint. Step 5 says do not allow inertia to become the constraint. If you've broken a constraint on the previous step, go back to step 1, find out where the new constraint is. But here again, something maybe counterintuitive would be every time a constraint moves, the rules have to change. Every time we have to change the rules, it causes instability, it causes disharmony, we'd have to get buy-in. So the best possible strategy would be to decide where you want the constraint to be, and then make sure it stays there. So when you get to step 4, which is elevate, you're not only elevating the system constraints capability, but you also elevate the capability of upstream and downstream resources so that you always have enough of to achieve the goal that you've determined. And how do you set goals that are achievable and ambitious? You have to know what your constraint is internally, so that you can use that to make reliable commitments, whether in a project environment or in distribution or retail or manufacturing or mining. It doesn't matter. You need to know what your internal constraint is so that you can make reliable commitments. So I hope that was useful. In summary, at least for me, theory of constraints is about identifying and overcoming constraints by identifying and resolving conflicts between what rules to use. Sometimes we can resolve these conflicts through logical analysis using a technique like the one I've developed called the Procon Cloud method. Sometimes the only way to do it is to run pilots, or ideally virtual pilots within simulation models. If you have any questions, please direct message me on any of the content that's in this video. If you have suggestions for other topics that you want me to record videos on, please direct message me. If you found what I delivered valuable, please like it, please share it, and consider following me and subscribing to my YouTube channel so that you always get the first access to these type of videos and case studies and new insights.